I was prepared for anger. That's the part that still confuses me. I had rehearsed it in my head, his voice raised just enough to shake, the tension in his jaw, the questions fired one after another. I told myself I could handle that. I could explain myself if he was angry. I could defend my reasons, soften my choices, reframe the story until it sounded less like betrayal and more like misunderstanding. What I wasn't prepared for was his calm. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was imagining things. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded loosely in front of him, listening while I spoke. He nodded when appropriate, didn't interrupt, didn't push back. When I finished talking, he simply said, "Okay." No follow-up, no reaction, no fight. That should have relieved me. Instead, it unsettled me. I had spent weeks convincing myself that what I'd done wasn't wrong, just complicated. That it made sense if you looked at it from my side. That circumstances mattered. Intentions mattered. That context could soften impact. I believed that if I explained myself well enough, he would understand. But understanding requires engagement. And he had already stopped engaging. At first, I told myself this was maturity, that this was what emotional growth looked like, two adults handling something difficult without drama. But something about the way he withdrew felt final. Not cold, not cruel, just complete. He didn't stop being kind. That was the strangest part. He still made coffee in the mornings, still asked if I needed anything from the store, still said goodnight before turning away to sleep. But there was no urgency anymore, no emotional pull. It was like living with someone who had already accepted an ending I was still trying to explain away. I kept talking. That's what I do when I'm nervous. I fill space with words. I justified everything aloud the way I had in my head. I explained the loneliness, the distance that had grown between us before anything else happened. I talked about feeling unseen, about how nothing physical had happened at first, about how I never intended to hurt him. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, searching for cracks, anger, hurt, anything that told me my words were landing somewhere. But his expression didn't change. He listened the way you listen to a story you've already finished processing. When I paused, waiting for a response, he didn't rush to fill the silence. He just sat there. That was when the fear started to creep in. Because anger would have meant he still needed something from me. This didn't. I told myself he was just processing, that he'd come back later with questions, that he'd need time before reacting. Days passed. He never asked. Not once. He didn't want details, didn't want reassurance, didn't want proof that I cared or promises that it wouldn't happen again. And slowly, I realized something I hadn't prepared for. He wasn't fighting because he wasn't confused. He already knew what this meant for him. The house changed without anything visibly changing. We still lived in the same space, but it felt carefully divided, not physically, emotionally, like invisible lines had been drawn that I instinctively knew not to cross. He stopped sharing his thoughts with me, the small ones that used to slip out without effort, observations about work, complaints about traffic, half-formed ideas that didn't matter but made us feel connected. Those disappeared first. Then came the distance in his body language. He stopped sitting close enough for our arms to brush, stopped reaching for me in the car, stopped touching me absent-mindedly when he passed by. None of it happened suddenly. That's what made it worse. It was a gradual withdrawal, executed so quietly I couldn't even pinpoint when it began. One evening, after another long stretch of silence, I said carefully, "You're being very calm about all this." He looked at me then. Not with anger, not with disappointment, just honesty. "I don't feel like fighting," he said. That sentence landed heavier than anything else he could have said. Because fighting would have meant hope. Fighting would have meant there was still something to save. Instead, he had chosen peace, and I was suddenly standing on the wrong side of it. I tried again, softer this time. I told him I understood why he was hurt, that I was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild trust, that I wanted us to work through it. He listened. Then he nodded. "I believe you," he said. That should have comforted me. It didn't, because belief wasn't the problem. Desire was, and I could feel it slipping away. I began to realize that all my explanations, the justifications I had clung to so tightly, weren't reaching him because he wasn't debating the past. He was deciding his future. There's a particular kind of dread that comes from watching someone emotionally step away while remaining physically present. You start noticing things you never paid attention to before. The way he packed his lunch without asking what I wanted. The way he planned his weekends independently. The way he stopped using we when he talked about the future. Every small change felt like a quiet confirmation that something irreversible was happening. I wanted to scream at him, to react, to get angry, to say something, anything, that would force us into the same emotional space again. But he wouldn't. And the longer he stayed calm, the more I understood what that calm represented. He had already done the work I was still avoiding. He had accepted. I realized then that I had been so focused on justifying myself that I hadn't noticed the most important thing. He wasn't listening to decide whether I was right or wrong. He was listening to decide whether he could still stay. And somewhere along the way, he had decided he couldn't. That was when it finally hit me. Silence isn't neutral. It's a choice. And his choice, to not fight, to not argue, to not demand answers, was more devastating than any confrontation could have been. Because it meant he wasn't trying to win. He was letting go. And no amount of explanation can compete with someone who has already made peace with leaving. After that conversation, I stopped trying to convince him of anything. Not because I didn't have more to say, but because I finally understood that my words no longer carried weight. I could explain myself endlessly, but explanations only matter when someone is still deciding how they feel. He was. What he felt had already settled. The days that followed were eerily normal. That was the part that unsettled me most. There were no dramatic changes, no visible signs of collapse. We still woke up at the same time, still ate meals in the same kitchen, still exchanged polite words that sounded like care but lacked warmth. He didn't punish me with distance. He simply removed himself from the emotional equation. I started noticing how carefully he moved through our shared space, not cautiously, intentionally, like someone who didn't want to disturb anything because he was already preparing to leave it behind. He stopped asking me how I was feeling, not out of cruelty, but because he no longer needed to know. My inner world had become something he wasn't responsible for anymore. One night, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, I tried to bridge the gap. "I don't feel like you're here," I said quietly. He didn't bristle, didn't sigh, didn't roll his eyes. He just looked at me thoughtfully, as if choosing his words with care. "I am," he said, "just not the way you want me to be." That sentence settled into me slowly. Because it wasn't defensive. It was honest. I realized then that he wasn't withholding affection to make a point. He wasn't trying to teach me a lesson or assert control. He was protecting himself. And there was nothing I could say that would make him stop. I began to understand that what I had called justification had felt like dismissal to him. That while I was busy explaining why my actions made sense, he was quietly deciding that he didn't want to live in a relationship where sense had to be argued for after trust was damaged. I had thought that if I could just make him see things from my perspective, everything would soften. But perspective doesn't rebuild safety. And safety, once lost, doesn't return just because someone says the right words. Weeks passed. The space between us became more defined, not wider, just clearer. Boundaries emerged without being spoken aloud. He stopped inviting me into his thoughts, stopped leaning on me emotionally, stopped assuming I would be part of his future plans. He still treated me with respect. That hurt more than anger ever could have. Because respect without intimacy feels like a farewell that hasn't been announced yet. I caught myself watching him more closely, as if I could learn something by observing the way he had changed. I noticed how calm he seemed, how unburdened. It dawned on me that, while I had been scrambling to justify myself, he had already begun to detach. I had thought that his silence meant he was waiting. Waiting to explode. Waiting to confront me. Waiting to decide. But he wasn't waiting. He had decided. The realization came one morning while we were both in the kitchen. He was making coffee, moving with a familiar ease that made my chest ache. I leaned against the counter and asked, "Do you ever think about what comes next?" He paused for just a second. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. And I pressed. He turned to look at me, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet resolve that I hadn't seen before. "I think about peace," he said. That was when I knew. Peace didn't include me anymore. Not in the way it used to. I felt something inside me finally give way, not collapse, but release. The frantic need to be understood faded, replaced by something heavier and harder to accept. Loss. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that seeps in slowly, until you realize you're standing alone in a relationship that technically still exists. We didn't have a dramatic ending. There was no final argument, no definitive moment where everything fell apart. Instead, there was a conversation that felt more like logistics than emotion. We talked about space, about time, about what made sense moving forward. Even then, he didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse, didn't ask me to explain myself again. And that silence, the continued absence of questions, followed me like a shadow. Because when someone doesn't ask, it means they don't need answers anymore. They've already reached their conclusion. The day he moved out, it happened quietly. No rushed packing, no bitterness. He thanked me for the years we had shared, told me he wished me well. I stood there, watching him leave, feeling the full weight of what his restraint had cost me. I had believed that marriage meant staying. That commitment meant endurance. That love, once promised, couldn't be withdrawn without a fight. I was wrong. What I learned instead was far more unsettling. People don't always leave because they stop loving you. Sometimes they leave because they stop feeling safe enough to fight for you. Sometimes silence isn't confusion. It's clarity. And once someone reaches that clarity, no explanation will pull them back into uncertainty. I had spent so much time justifying everything that I failed to notice the one thing that mattered most. He wasn't asking because he didn't want to rebuild. He was done carrying the weight. Silence had replaced effort. Acceptance had replaced hope. And that was the consequence I hadn't prepared for. Not being shouted at, not being blamed, but being released, quietly, permanently, without resistance. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been hurt not by what someone said, but by what they chose not to say, take a moment to like this video. If you want more stories where the damage is quiet, where the ending isn't loud but lasting, subscribe. And if you've ever mistaken justification for understanding or silence for patience, share your thoughts in the comments. Some endings don't announce themselves. They just happen while you're still explaining.